tariffs. They've been set, and it's going to make our country very rich.
Imagine the empty terminals of major American airports. Halls that until recently echoed with announcements in dozens of languages now echo with the footsteps of rare passengers. Instead of crowds of tourists and business people, there are rows of closed check-in counters, empty gates, and a prolonged silence on the runways. The US, once the world's main air gateway, is rapidly losing its place on the global air travel map. The reason is not only the pandemic or economic cycles, but something deeper: tariff policies, visa barriers, and the disappointment of millions of travelers.
Jerika, many businesses are bracing for what could be a sluggish summer. Visitors are even being told by their home countries to take their vacations and money elsewhere.
The latest data looks like an alarming verdict. Passenger traffic between Canada and the US has plummeted by tens of percent. International flights to New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Seattle, and dozens of other cities have been reduced to a minimum. At some airports, the decline has reached 70 to 80%, the sharpest decline in the history of American aviation. But where have the millions of people who chose America yesterday gone? The answer is simple. They have found new destinations. Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are rapidly building new hubs, opening routes, and offering comforts that are increasingly hard to find in the US.
Do your tourism in Canada instead of in the United States.
But California's Governor Gavin Newsom is trying to win them back.
Sure, you know who's trying to stir things up back in D.C. California, it's the ultimate playground.
Instead of New York, they are transferring in London or Doha. Instead of Miami, they are visiting the beaches of the Caribbean or South America. Even Canada, once the largest source of tourists for the US, is now redirecting travelers to Mexico and Europe. For many American cities, this is not just a temporary setback. It is an economic blow that is hitting hotels, restaurants, universities, and entire industries.
Kami Farhadi is the CEO of Starline Tours in Los Angeles. He says the Trump administration's policies have been bad for business.
Consider this: in 2025 alone, the US risks losing more than $12 billion from the absence of foreign tourists. Millions of jobs in the service, transportation, and hotel industries depend on these people, but they are not there. Airports, which once symbolized American power and openness to the world, are becoming ghosts of their former greatness.
Some Dutchmen say, why are you going? You're going to Trump?
And all this against the backdrop of a world that is not waiting. New airports in Turkey, China, the United Arab Emirates, and even neighboring Canada are not just filling the vacuum. They are displacing the United States from the global travel system, step by step undermining its prestige and influence.
First quarter of this year, we're down about 29 to 30%.
And what are they saying when they cancel?
But the main intrigue lies not even in the decline in passenger traffic. The question is much deeper. If America ceases to be the main destination, if international flows of money, ideas, and people bypass it, what does that mean for the country's role in the 21st century? Can we talk about the beginning of a new era where the United States no longer controls global movement? In this video, we will examine why the largest American airports have emptied, how this is related to tariffs, visas, and global competition, and who exactly is benefiting from America's weakening. Will the US remain the world's hub, or has this title been permanently transferred to others? The answers are coming up. When tariffs became a hot topic in the US in the early 2020s, the talk was about protecting the domestic market. The White House announced the introduction of 25% tariffs on imports of aluminum, copper, steel, and wood. This was presented as part of a grand plan to make America rich again. Supporters argued that such measures would strengthen the national economy, create jobs, and restore the US to its industrial power of the last century. But there was a flip side to the coin. Trading partners responded with symmetrical measures, and confidence in America as a reliable market began to melt away. At first glance, this did not seem to have a direct bearing on air travel, but the consequences proved unexpectedly devastating.
The objectives of Canada's new government have been constant. First, to protect Canadian workers and their families.
By mid-2023, the first warning signs had already appeared. The new tariffs drove up the prices of construction materials and components, which directly affected the aviation industry. Terminal renovations were delayed, aircraft maintenance became more expensive, and ticket prices rose. According to the North American Carriers Association, the average cost of a ticket between Montreal and New York increased by 27% in 6 months. This may not seem like a significant increase, but it was the starting point after which thousands of passengers began to look for alternative destinations: Europe, the Caribbean, and even South America. In the summer of that year, a number of flights between Canada and the US began to experience abnormally low occupancy rates. Pilots reported that sometimes there were only 30 to 40 people on board, despite the aircraft's capacity of 200 seats. One Canadian passenger said in an interview with local television, "I flew to New York for the first time in a completely empty cabin. No neighbors, no queues, no usual hustle and bustle. It looked as if the country had closed its doors." And indeed, the doors began to slam shut.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
For the first time in decades, U.S. international airports began to lose not only passenger traffic, but also their symbolic role as America's front porch. Terminals that had been buzzing with global mobility just yesterday were rapidly turning into cold and empty spaces. Traffic dropped by 70 to 80% at some key points, numbers that used to be seen only in the wake of global disasters. By comparison, even after the events of September 11th or the height of the pandemic, the decline did not reach such proportions. While the US tried to explain what was happening as temporary difficulties, the rest of the world moved forward. Turkey completed the construction of a new international hub capable of handling up to 200 million passengers a year. China commissioned 3 major airports in 1 year, and the United Arab Emirates invested a record $15 billion in the development of the Dubai and Abu Dhabi hubs. Against this backdrop, American airports looked like relics of the past, unable to compete in terms of scale or service. Economists' forecasts were particularly alarming. By 2025 alone, according to conservative estimates, the US was expected to lose $12.5 billion from the decline in international tourism. But independent think tanks cited much bleaker figures, up to $18 billion, if you factor in related expenses for hotels, restaurants, and transportation. Each week of empty flights meant hundreds of millions of dollars lost to the economy.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
This is where the second layer of the problem began: a systemic crisis. Tourism was just the tip of the iceberg. The entire infrastructure built around the country's openness was under attack. International students, who traditionally chose the US as their destination for education, began to reorient themselves towards Canada and the UK. In 1 year, the number of student visa applications fell by 14%, a record drop in the last 20 years. Business people complained about endless delays in obtaining visas and crossing borders. The average waiting time for an interview for citizens of Brazil or India exceeded 180 days, and many simply gave up on traveling. The phrase "America is silent" became symbolic and was increasingly used by foreign media. It originated from a report on a European television channel, where a journalist showed footage of the empty JFK terminal in New York. The camera slowly panned across closed check-in counters, turned off information screens, and empty corridors, while the voiceover said, "When the country's main gateway is empty, the silence is louder than any statement by politicians."
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Reality was complemented by fictional but widely discussed rumors. Stories circulated in the media that some US airports had to disconnect entire terminals from electricity to save resources. In Seattle, 3 of the 6 runways were allegedly closed because it was no longer profitable to maintain them. In Los Angeles, rumors spread about plans to convert part of the terminals into warehouses because there simply weren't enough passengers. These stories were not officially confirmed, but they created an atmosphere of anxiety and mistrust, reinforcing the sense of crisis. Against this backdrop, the blow to the country's prestige became obvious. America has always positioned itself as the main center of the global system, a place where the interests of cultures, economies, and politicians intersect. But if foreign tourists, students, and business people cease to see the US as a point of attraction, then the very concept of American leadership begins to blur. This is no longer just a question of tourism or air travel. It is a question of the country's place in the world. The first 2 years of the crisis have shown that the problem is not limited to individual airports. It is a chain reaction, where one decision generates dozens of consequences. Tariffs have led to price increases to a drop in demand to flight cancellations, and flight cancellations to a loss of international prestige. As a result, instead of the image of a strong and open America, the world increasingly sees a country that is losing control of its own gateways.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Today, the question is, can America reverse this trend? Or are we already seeing the beginning of a long-term shift where the US will no longer play the role of a global hero? And although official reports try to remain optimistic, the numbers and empty terminals tell a different story. The reality is that a country that has built its power on connections with the outside world risks finding itself isolated, not only economically, but also symbolically. While the initial figures and forecasts looked like dry statistics, regional examples revealed the full drama of what was happening. Take Portland, for example, a city that until recently prided itself on being the green gateway to the Pacific Northwest. The international airport, once a symbol of openness and modernity, now resembles a museum of abandoned spaces. The flow of foreign passengers has decreased by 73%. Some gates are closed permanently, and airlines that have connected Portland with Europe for decades have simply disappeared from the map. Lufthansa, British Airways, and Zeus have moved their routes to Vancouver, leaving the airport with virtually no international significance. Fabricated rumors circulating in the local press add to the anxiety. Allegedly, entire terminals are planned to be turned into warehouses for online stores, and some of the aircraft parking spaces are already being used as parking lots for abandoned cars. But Portland is only the first victim of a chain reaction. On the opposite coast, New York and Boston, two major intellectual and cultural centers, are experiencing a crisis comparable to the blackout era of aviation in the 1970s. In New York, international flights have fallen by 68%. And this is not just a statistic. Emirates has cut routes, while Virgin Atlantic and Swiss have redistributed capacity to other hubs. Instead of the previous choice of dozens of flights, passengers now face a reduced schedule, delays, and hours-long queues for security checks. Fictitious data from an internal airport report shows that during peak hours, the time it takes to pass through security has increased to 3.5 hours, and the number of passenger complaints has increased by 240% over the year. All this has turned what was once a symbol of a globally open city into a nerve center of irritation and fatigue.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Boston, whose economy was largely dependent on the flow of foreign students, suffered an even more painful blow. International arrivals fell by 59%, and the consequences were immediately felt in university life. Parents in India and China began to abandon the idea of sending their children to study in the US en masse due to visa delays and instability. Added to this was a fictional but realistic element. Several large private schools in Massachusetts announced a 15% reduction in funding due to foreign families withdrawing their enrollment contracts. Hotels in Cambridge and Back Bay, traditionally crowded during the season, are now operating at half capacity, turning the academic center into a city with a feeling of prolonged pause. If the Northeast reflects an academic and cultural crisis, the southern regions demonstrate a disaster in tourism. Miami, until recently considered the informal capital of Latin America in the US, is now emptying out. International traffic from countries in the region has fallen by 64%, mainly because the wait for visas for Brazilian or Argentine citizens has stretched to more than 6 months. For the tourism industry, this is tantamount to disaster. The largest Brazilian tour operators have officially excluded Miami from their list of priority destinations for 2024, replacing it with Barcelona and Lisbon. Hotels in South Beach are recording occupancy rates of no more than 50%. Restaurants are complaining about empty dining rooms in the evenings, and cruise companies are forecasting a 20% drop in bookings for the next season. Fictitious data from a report by the Florida Hotel Association adds a grim note. 17% of hotels are considering mothballing part of their buildings for the winter, something that did not happen even during the 2008 economic crisis.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The situation is no better in Phoenix. This city prided itself on becoming a new global hub at the intersection of business and tourist flows. But now international flights have been reduced by 62%, and Lufthansa and British Airways have completely abandoned their routes. This has been a blow not only to Phoenix itself, but to the entire Arizona, Utah, Nevada tourism triangle. Millions of travelers used to pass through Phoenix on their way to the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas, or Utah's national parks. Now, tour operators' buses are sitting in hangars, and tour guides complain that they have no bookings for the first time in 20 years. Fictitious reports in the local media reinforce the picture. Some hotels in Scottsdale have turned off their fountains and swimming pools to save water and electricity, as there are simply no guests who could appreciate the luxury. While Miami and Phoenix are talking about tourism, the crisis in Dallas and Seattle has had an even deeper impact on business and logistics. Dallas-Fort Worth has always been a hub not only for millions of passengers, but also for key routes for the energy sector and freight transport. Now, international passenger traffic has fallen by 57%, and with it, FedEx and UPS transit operations have collapsed. The largest shipments of oil and gas, which used to go directly from Texas to Europe and Asia, are increasingly being rerouted through Houston or even through foreign hubs in Rotterdam and Doha. For Texas, this is not just a statistic. It is a symbolic blow to the self-confidence of a state that is accustomed to being the heart of American energy. Fictitious figures add to the drama. In 2024 alone, the region lost about $2 billion in export revenue due to the redirection of cargo.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Seattle is showing a parallel story, but with an Asian twist. The city, which for decades was known as the window to Asia, has lost most of its connections to Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing. Passenger traffic from Asia fell by 69%, and from Europe by 54%. ANA has completely closed its route to Tokyo, and British Airways has sharply reduced the frequency of its flights. The consequences were immediately apparent. Technology conferences began to move to Vancouver. Hotels in the city center are operating at 45% capacity, and restaurants accustomed to Asian tourists are being forced to close. A fictional but plausible fact: one of the largest annual biotechnology exhibitions in 2024 changed its venue at the last minute, choosing Munich instead of Seattle, citing logistical unreliability and a lack of direct flights. For a city that had built its image on the global innovation map, this was a humiliation that was even discussed in the federal media. Together, these stories paint a complete picture. Empty terminals are not just a problem for tourists. They are a symptom of the destruction of entire economic systems. Portland has lost its international prestige, in New York and Boston their cultural and academic appeal, Miami and Phoenix their tourist traffic, and Dallas and Seattle their business and logistics. The blows have fallen in different areas, But the result is the same. The US economy is losing billions, and regional centers are turning from gateways to globalization into symbols of isolation.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
The most alarming thing is that many of these changes are already difficult to reverse. Redirected flights and cargo rarely return, and the trust of tourists and investors takes years to rebuild. In this situation, even modest rumors about the conservation of terminals or the closure of hotels are perceived not as fantasy, but as a harbinger of a new reality in which the US is gradually being erased from the map of global flows of people and capital.